Hello, everybody. My name is Maurice Button. I'm the CEO of City and Financial Global, and I'd like to welcome you to the latest in our series of speaker interviews. Today, I have the pleasure of having with me Maya Lester, KC, a barrister at Brick Court Chambers who specialises in sanctions law. And Maya's going to be giving a talk at our Economic Sanctions Summit being held in central London on the 29th of January. Maya, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Let's turn to the questions, if we may, Maya. I understand that there's been a ruling, or there will be a ruling this morning, from people who are challenging the fact that they appear on UK sanction lists. Can you tell us a little about that?
Sure. Well, there's one judgment coming out today in one of these cases, but there is a series of cases coming through the courts now, which are cases brought by people who have been added to sanctions lists by the UK, who challenge the fact that they are on those lists on various different grounds. Sometimes, most obviously, because they say this is just a disproportionate restriction on my fundamental rights. The impact of it is too great, and I shouldn't be on this for various reasons. So one of those is coming out today. There's an important one that I think will probably set the ground for how these cases will be decided, which is going to the Court of Appeal in the middle of January. So far, the government has prevailed in these cases because the courts have really said this is an area of foreign policy discretionary decision making, which isn't one for the courts to get involved in an inappropriate way, but the courts do give kind of human rights scrutiny to these decisions. So the one coming out this morning is in a case called Graham Phillips, which raises all sorts of interesting issues. So watch this space generally.
Very good. Well, obviously, we'll discuss that in more detail at the event. Turning to the next question, the comments of the Court of Appeal in the Mintz case in relation to Putin's control over all Russian organizations and the subsequent clarification and guidance from the SCDO caused quite a lot of consternation at the end of last year. What advice would you give to companies dealing with Russian organizations in light of that guidance?
Excellent question. I mean, just to outline the issue for those who perhaps aren't quite as steeped in this topic, I mean, targeted sanctions measures apply not only to those who are expressly on the sanctions list, but also to companies who are owned or controlled by people on the list. So sanctions now isn't just a question of screening lists. You actually have to do some analysis of who or controls of which companies those listed own or control. Now, the test in UK regulations is very broad and very subjective for ownership or control. So in particular, what it says is a designated person, that's someone who is listed, controls a company if there's reason to expect that he or she would, if they chose to, be able to achieve the result that the company's affairs are conducted in accordance with their wishes. Now, that's sometimes glossed as kind of, can they call the shots or not? Not always, but in significant respects, directly and indirectly. Now, this has been a massive issue because people need to know whether they're dealing with sanctioned entities or not. And so the Court of Appeal in the case you mentioned, Mintz, were commenting in the context of the fact that President Putin and the governor of the central bank of Russia and other key political figures have been sanctioned, and therefore the issue is it therefore right to assume that in an economy like Russia and a political system like Russia, could it be said that since President Putin ultimately can come in and control any company, that one ought to assume that all, either public or perhaps even all companies in Russia, should be seen as controlled because this is a command economy and this is Russia we're talking about. Now, the Court of Appeal said no. What the Court of Appeal really said is if on one view the test is as broad as that, then that's something that needs to be amended by legislation and isn't really for the courts to try to read in a narrower test. There's a subsequent case where the judge said that seems a bit broad, and actually this is more about looking at the existing influence that a designated person has rather than can someone call in and wind the company up. The government, as you said, has put out some guidance in light of the great uncertainty created by all of this, saying that the government doesn't take the view that somebody controls a company just because they have a leadership function within the government, and the government will try to designate, i.e. specifically list at least public companies where they think there is control. So where does all this leave us? It leaves, I think, in a great state of legal uncertainty, because it's very hard to give clear advice on, how to apply this very broad control test. And it's not very satisfactory that different courts have reached very different views on the same legal test. I think what is clear is that, first of all, the government doesn't really like answering this question itself. So I think now the position is probably letters to the government saying, do you think this company is controlled? Normally meet with, you need to make that assessment yourself, go and take legal advice. I think some comfort can certainly be drawn from the fact that it's very unlikely the government would take enforcement action just on the basis that, for example, the president controls all companies in Russia, given what they've now said. But the key issue really is, it all still comes down to the evidence on control of a company in a particular case. And the pressing issue is, what kind of evidence, to what kind of evidential standard, how much due diligence do you need to do in a particular case? And that really is the job of many people who will be attending your conference and discussing these issues.
Yeah, a complex issue, and given the nature of that sort of control, very, very hard to prove, I suspect, in some cases. Turning to China now, a few days ago, China announced that it's imposing sanctions against 5 US arms companies for arms sales to Taiwan. This follows sanctions against other US companies by China. Do you think that China-Taiwan will be the next sanctions hotspot? And how do you think the US and other Western states will react?
Well, as you say, I mean, there already are fairly significant export restrictions on China by the West, and sort of human rights related sanctions. I mean, it's a very tricky political question that you ask, whether sanctions are likely. It really very much depends what happens, in particular in relation to Taiwan. I think it's certainly correct to say that people are actively planning for what sanctions might look like and trying to learn lessons from Russia. It's certainly wise for people to do so. On my website, globalsanctions.co.uk, you'll find webinars actually both on the issue of ownership and control and on the issue of what China sanctions might look like. I think it's also fair to say that the US tends to take the lead on sanctions, at least sanctions imposed by the West. And it certainly seems to regard China as a very significant economic and political competitor stroke threat. I think the question of who knows if conflict relating to Taiwan is likely or not, that's not one really for the lawyers to speculate on, but certainly active planning and consideration is being given to what those sanctions might look like.
Yeah, I guess preparation is essential, isn't it? As the world seems to be a bit more turbulent, and it's very hard to predict.
And of course, it also depends, to what extent businesses have, of course, exposure to China. But I expect that if there are sanctions on China, given how involved China is in the economy, Russia may then start to look like small fry by comparison. Yeah,
there's a thought. Our final question, because sadly I think we're under a bit of time pressure now. In the UK, OFSI have reported a large increase in the number of investigations into sanctions breaches. Do you think that the enforcement regime is becoming stricter? And what can companies do to protect their position?
I think there certainly are indications that there may be a greater degree of public enforcement. There's been an announcement of a new body, the Office of Trade Sanctions Implementation. I don't know whether the election will affect this, but certainly the intention is that that will get off the ground at some point, I think this year, 2024. More money has been put into enforcement. OFSI has a greatly expanded enforcement team. Other agencies, of course, are involved in enforcement too. I think OFSI's latest annual review suggested somewhere around 200 odd cases actively under investigation. And of course, there are very significant self-reporting obligations, at least on regulated firms, to report potential breaches to OFSI. So I think they've got a lot on their desk. I think it's still true that there are very few public enforcement decisions. although the message is that there's quite a lot of, settlement type letters going on behind the scenes. I think for my part, it's a disadvantage of that approach is that we don't have the sort of lessons learned aspect of public enforcement decisions that you get from OFAC, for example. But I think it is fair to think that we might be able to expect more public enforcement, particularly in sort of egregious cases of sanctions breach. I mean, in terms of what companies can do, I think that most enforcement has been done in the UK and in most EU countries too, through compliance rather than public enforcement. My perception is, of course, with a few exceptions, there is a great culture now of trying to comply with what are very significantly complex sanctions overlapping different regimes, very, very fast moving. And so what people can do is obviously, continue to try to comply insofar as they can with this very complex web of restrictions.
Yeah, a complex situation, as you say, and companies obviously need to be on their toes. Our time is up. For our viewers, if you'd like to hear more about these and related issues, please do attend our upcoming Economic Sanctions Summit in London on 29th January to hear more from an excellent lineup of speakers, including Maya. And Maya, thank you so much for your time today and explaining those issues to us.
Great pleasure. Thank you.